Hi. I want to make a quick video on a simple subject that I've mentioned in passing in other videos, and it's this idea about describing reality versus reality existing in and of itself. And it doesn't need your description, doesn't need your interaction. The tree in the forest doesn't need you to hear it or sense the physical sound waves, the things that are vibrating through the air for you to for it actually have to make those sound waves. It still makes a sound regardless. And it goes back to this mechanical thought process thing that we're experiencing as well. Sort of like it's more about your reactions to things than the thought process, the way that you react. Obviously, your thought and your reactions can be in words and descriptions, but those words and descriptions in and of themselves, within those words and descriptions, means less than the reaction that you have. Because you can only explain something so much in words, and your reaction means everything. But we can only react so much before our reactions become redundant. Before we say, that goes back to the idea enough's enough. It goes back to this idea that our reactions are redundant and they can only go to a certain point so much. You can only go so many times before you've done the same thing over and over again, and you've been in that same position over and over again. And it's the reaction that matters, but the reaction's redundant, and it almost requires something on, say, a visceral reaction. Even though your words are reactions, it's about disconnecting a description and saying and explaining something and just seeing something in and of itself, as opposed to communicating the idea in any other way. And obviously my voice and words are reactions. I guess this almost comes to the distinction of visceral reactions, because my voice is a reaction of something else and so forth. But saying a traumatic event that you say you experienced, the visceral reaction that they see you experiencing, you mumbling to yourself, you crying to yourself, means more than the words that you almost have a disconnection from it to the event that you have in describing something to someone, other than the reaction if you say, I'm being unable to finish a sentence because you're so distraught about something, you're just so despondent, you're so distressed about something. It's more about seeing than hearing it. Seeing it, then putting it in words, and hearing it, and describing the situation and articulating the situation. It's more about that kind of concept. It's more about seeing the person's visceral reactions, or the reactions and how they react to the environment, as opposed to how they decide to articulate these things through words. And that goes to the idea of describing something. It doesn't need it. It's more about the reaction. It's more about the pain. And the pain exists, and it doesn't need your explanation, your existence to be there. It only needs that person existing. Once no one exists, it doesn't mean anything. But since this person has existed, or will exist, or is existing, it means something. And the words can only describe so much, and it's the reaction that means something, and the words are nothing more. Unless the words coming out of your mouth are causing pain, they don't mean much of anything other than the prevention and description of understanding, and trying to project it into someone else's mind, or trying to get someone to understand something. So unless describing reality, as opposed to just reacting and experiencing it, it's the experience that matters. It's the reaction that matters more than the description that matters. And your reaction, and that you know something. It's more that you know something, and you're aware of something, and that you react to something. And you can only know so much, you can only explain so much what you know. You find your certain way of describing something, and you know it, you perceptually recognize it. That's why sometimes there's a disconnection between recognizing something and describing it. It's so hard to describe it. There's sometimes there's very vague memories where you feel like you felt something in those reactions. Sort of like you tangibly felt a certain sensation in your mouth and your body, but you can't quite put your hands on anymore because it's lost in the past. It's a very vague thing that you can't necessarily put on. It's not something you can necessarily describe, because it's a very vague thing, almost a psychological dream-like state that you can't necessarily recall. Sort of like being half asleep and not necessarily recalling that it was a real or non-real event, because you're half asleep and you can't realize if you were actually up or you weren't actually up, or a sensation you were feeling, a very strange, otherworldly kind of feeling, or not necessarily understanding the sensation, and it meant more, say, in the past when you're experiencing it, and then now, because you can't put your hands on it anymore, it becomes less. But it might be just because you've recognized it more, and you can't be caught up in feeling these same old redundant sensations that you've felt that cause this imprinting on your mind. And you recognize it in a way, but you can't put your hands on it. You can't feel it physically the same way you did. You can't perceptually recognize it or feel it the same way you did, because you can't put your hands on it. So yeah, anyway, like from dreams or whatever it may be. So it goes down to this idea that, yeah, the same old idea. It doesn't need, the tree in the forest doesn't need you to fall for it to have made the sound waves. It's just your interaction that you have with the sound waves. They still made them, it's just no one was there to collect them. And to a certain extent, the further away you are, you're going to collect them, but it's going to take longer to get to you, and it's not going to be as strong. You're not going to hear it as loudly. But you're still getting them. It still happened. There still was an initial cause. Even if you're far away and you hear it, why not just say, well, I heard it from 100 feet away. Well, I can hear it from 1,000 feet away. Even if I don't hear it, it still made the waves. And if I stepped 20 feet closer, I wouldn't have been able to hear it. So it still happened. It still had an initial cause that caused the vibrations to move. The tree falling caused the things to move in and of themselves, the vibrations to move. And if you happened to have been 50 feet closer, you would have heard them. Or you would have heard them, and sometimes you hear things and you don't even recognize it, or you see things and you don't even recognize it. It just passes through your stimulus and you don't even recognize it. So it's about knowing things. It's about the interaction. The interaction matters, but it doesn't need your interaction for the other thing to have existed, to have interacted with you, or your unconscious body, or whatever it may. It doesn't need to have interacted. It's just your reaction to that reaction causing an interaction. It doesn't need your interaction for that initial reaction to have existed. Sort of like it's the reactions that matter. It's that you know something, and it doesn't matter. And your explanation means little in the way of describing. It doesn't need your explanation to describe it, and it's more that you react, and you can only react so much to a certain situation. And you can only, it almost goes to the idea, how much do you have to take? How much pain do you have to take? How much of the same reaction over and over again before it becomes too much? How much of the same painful interaction that shouldn't have caused you to question life and say just why and not end at all? And obviously you can turn that into something else. You can turn it into anger, whatever it may be, but there's only so much you can have this interaction over and over again before you're just doing the same thing. You're just doing the same redundant task where it doesn't mean much of anything experiencing the same, say, deprivation or pain over and over again. And you can only play the same play over and over again before something decides to say enough's enough, or whatever it may be, or enough's enough in a certain situation, or enough's enough in life in general, or whatever it may be. Or you see a bigger picture in the end, and you say, I'm going to turn this into motivation, this pain, this interaction. I'm going to turn this reaction to something different. But the reaction is going to lead to an end, and it can only lead to an end to such a degree. It can only lead to a degree to such a degree. You can only go so far in certain reactions. At that point, they become redundant, and that's life. Is redundancy and doing the same thing over and over again. So, yes. Your reactions, your knowledge means more than your description of that knowledge or actions. It's the fact that you react, not the fact that you articulate that, say, after your actions, other than the reaction of your talking, and based on the previous interactions around you, and the interaction of your talking in of itself, and the interactions happen you causing you to talk, or, say, articulate thoughts. And it's almost a needless distinction I'm making, but it's a distinction nonetheless. I'm trying to describe some kind of distinction, a reasonable distinction, I would say, at the least, very least. So saying it in words, our vocabulary means less than how you actually describe it or you react to a certain situation, be it in the moment in describing it or in the moment after reacting and using the words to describe the thing that you initially reacted to. It's more about that reaction, and the reaction, you can only go so far before the reactions become redundant, almost begging the question, how much can you take before enough's enough? Before you just begin having the same reactions to even greater and greater harm, before you become completely complacent, and there's nothing you can do to feel anything at that point. And life wants you to feel pain, so you feel something. It wants you to know that there's prickly things in there, and otherwise it might tear your skin off. But obviously I wouldn't need the skin if I wasn't existing to begin with, so why have the skin if it's just going to be painful? Just to make sure I live long enough to feel more pain and avoid more pain. Because that's all we're doing, is avoiding pain to live long enough to avoid more pain in the future. That's all life is, and that's all existence is expecting out of us, or leaving us at the disposal of. So I think that's all I want to say. So yes, your knowledge, your interaction means something, but it doesn't need your interaction, but your interaction means something. Your knowing, your reaction means something, but your articulation doesn't mean something other than the fact that it is, by qualification, a reaction in of itself. But to a certain circumstance in making those distinctions, it doesn't mean anything as much as the reaction in describing a human circumstance, because if we're just going to go in circles about this, we can't describe anything to a certain extent if we're going to keep saying, oh, we can't describe it this way, but there are distinctions. And I'm trying to make those distinctions in between describing in words and our vocabulary and describing something out of my mouth and the visceral or the reaction that you have. Obviously, this is a reaction to something else, the words, but the words and articulation in and of themselves don't do anything compared to the knowledge or the interaction or reaction that you have to a certain circumstance and interaction. So articulating on the aware conscious level doesn't mean anything beyond a reaction to an initial reaction and so on and so forth. So we're just reacting to our words or reaction to our initial reaction, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. So I think that's all I want to say. So just it's our knowledge and our reactions that matter more than our articulation. Even our articulation is an action in of itself as well. So thank you, and until next time, bye.